Years ago, I loved visiting Turkey. It was Middle Eastern and European. It was Muslim and secular. It was free and democratic, more or less. And the food was great. Now, well, I'm told the food is still great. To explain what's happened and what is happening in Turkey, we're joined by Sinan Ciddi, a non-resident senior fellow here at FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's also an associate professor of national security studies at the Marine Corps University in Quantico. Earlier, Sinan was executive director of the Institute of Turkish Studies based at Georgetown University. He continues to serve as an adjunct associate professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He received his doctorate from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and he's the author of Kemalism in Turkish Politics, the Republican People's Party, Secularism and Nationalism. I'm pleased he could join us. I'm Cliff May, and I'm pleased you're with us too, here on Foreign Policy. Good to see you, Sinan.
Hi, Cliff. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Look, I think people always want to know a little about those providing analysis and opinions. So just give us a thumbnail sketch of your background, your Turkish and American journeys, as it were.
Well, that's a good start. I mean, I guess I already get to talk about that with most folks. But I'm 100% Turkish, born and bred. By Turkish parents. My father was an Air Force pilot. My mother was a flight attendant. And after my dad went civilian, they met each other. And their claim to fame is the first flight crew in Turkish Airlines history to ever get married in 1976, I believe. Which before then it was precluded by the company. Did not want employees fraternizing.
Really?
They did away with that policy after that, I guess, and obviously the rest is history. But unlike a lot of my Turkish friends, I guess I really did not spend a lot of time in Turkey going to schools. I was shipped off to England at an earlier age.
Because your parents just thought it was useful, or?
Well, my father was very disturbed by the last big coup attempt in Turkey, which was successful in 1980, and he was very angry after that, which lasted 4 years. And my father looked around and said, "I'm not sending my child to a school system which run by a junta regime in a country. I'm not doing this." And this is despite his military background as a military pilot. He just got fed up, and so England he thought was a good place to send a child to school.
This is jumping ahead, but I'll forget if I don't ask you now. The Europeans and a lot of Americans all thought, if Turkey is going to be European, if it's going to come to the European Union, if it's going to be democratic, then the military needs to be reined in. But the other view, among a lot of people who are very sophisticated, is no, you don't understand. It is the military that keeps Turkey secular, that keeps the separation of mosque and state. Once you don't have that, you will lose that. And in fact, that's kind of what happened later on. Just give me a minute on that.
Right. I think that's a good sort of contentious sort of fault line that Turkey's always gripped with, because the Turkish military is sort of the child, or if you will, or the bosom, the sort of inspired institution of Kemal Atatürk. He was also a military officer, the founder of modern Turkey. But his perspective was, to lay down the uniform and keep the military out of politics. But long after his death, the military was always, intrigued in the political realm, simply because they were afraid of civilians and civilian governments, especially derailing Turkey from its secular and sort of publicly accountable sort of track, precisely because of sort of Islamist movements that cropped up in the late 1990s, namely that of Erdogan's regime, which they had dealt very heavy-handedly with before. So you're sort of, the military was always damned if it did something, and it was damned if it didn't, as in, like, you have equal parts of society in Turkey who say, well, no, the military should stay in its barracks and not interfere with politics. But then a strong segment of vein in Turkish society which say, well, no, the military has been the guarantor, and if the military had done its job, they will say Erdogan would not be abusing power today.
Right. And we are jumping ahead, but once Erdogan got in power, he began to squeeze the military and prevent the military from doing, if you think that's its job, of maintaining secularism, stopping Islamism from rising back into the. Anyhow, that's all right. I want to do a little bit of history. I always think it's interesting. Again, very, very quick, but I think it's important for people. If you're going to understand a country, you need to understand its history. The land we now call Turkey, or Turkiye, which is what the government prefers, was conquered by Turkic tribes from Central Asia.
Correct.
They first began arriving in significant numbers in the 11th century, really. And then between the 11th and 13th centuries, there was the establishment a permanent presence with the rise of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, right? That's what you would call it. And of course, then, most important, there was the conquest of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Christian, Greek, in 1453 by Sultan Mehmed II. Now, today, that former Christian capital is called Istanbul. So I think this strikes me as interesting in that people don't realize in the same century that Turks arrive in Asia Minor or Anatolia, which is how it was known back then, Europeans first arrive in the Americas. Same century, not that far apart, right? I mean, the conquest of 1453, right? 1492, Columbus, right? So if someone were interested in discussing settler colonialism, that might be an interesting place to start. That's what's happening at Columbia University. All right, so then you get now, fast forward a bit, you get the Ottoman Empire, which is also a caliphate. Very important. It's a caliph, there's a sultan. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. Religious and and political. The caliphate and Ottoman Empire colonized countries, invaded, conquered, colonized, took slaves. They were big slave traders, including from Europe. People don't. This is actually true. Slave and Slav have the same linguistic root,
right?
Because Slavs were people like taking Slavs as slaves, so that's interesting. All right, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which was a result of the Ottomans aligning with Germany in World War I, and Germany lost.
Bad move,
right? The empire and caliphate disintegrate. The last sultan or the last caliph, I forget what, I think put on the Orient Express to Vienna from Istanbul. No,
one-way papers. I think they got on a ship. They were given one-way passports.
Okay, okay. Yeah.
Better than being put to execution.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Much better. And then, as you now have pointed out, Ataturk, Kemal Ataturk meaning father of Turkey. That's correct. That's the nickname he gives himself. What was his name before that? It was
Mustafa Kemal.
Mustafa Kemal. He establishes Turkey as a nation state, and a nation state looking towards Europe, which seemed more dynamic in those days.
Right.
And so you have the Latin alphabet replacing the Arabic alphabet. You have separation of mosque and church, mosque and state, all of that. Also, you have, and this is also important, relevant, you have in 1923 a compulsory population transfer.
Right.
Turkey and Greece. Now, the interesting thing here is that it wasn't based on nationality or ethnicity. It was based on religion.
Yes.
So that if you were a Turkish-speaking Christian, you went to Greece.
Correct.
If you were a Greek-speaking Muslim, you went to Turkey. I think it was 1.5 Greeks from Anatolia and 500,000 Muslims to Turkey. And up to 100,000 people were killed in this population exchange. Population exchanges everywhere, whether in Greece and Turkey, whether in India when it separates into India and Pakistan on the basis of religion. Palestine, the population transfer, both Palestinian Muslim refugees as a result of the war fought against the Israeli state in 48-49, or the 700,000, 800,000 Jews from Muslim states who fled, most of them going to Israel, supporting Israel. That's sort of the way history goes. Anyhow, I throw that all out because I think people need to know it.
Sure.
And say anything you want to on any of that.
No, it's the population exchanges were quite traumatic. That really sort of was, it was well intentioned, because the idea was like the new republic did not want to see reprisals carried out against its former foes. It wasn't seen as a sort of punishment. But what happened was you're uprooting sort of scores of generations of people whose only sort of common denominator is the fact that they're Orthodox. And you ship them off to Greece,
yeah.
Right? And as far as the Greeks were concerned, those were not Greeks. They saw them as fifth columnists, as suspicious, something to be suspected and feared of. They were never given equal treatment. And same with the Muslims who came from Greece, who did not even speak, modern Turkish, right?
Yeah,
and so their only common denominator was the fact that they were Muslim by background, and it was quite traumatic. But also, modern Turkey lost a lot of its artisanal and middle classes once the Greeks left, and obviously the Armenian genocide put an end to it.
The Armenian genocide, just so people understand what you're talking about at that point, you can talk about the time period, Turks killing Armenian Christians.
Correct. In 1915. Yep. It was
In
seen as
1950, even before. And that went on for many, many years, actually.
Correct. Yep. It was seen as it was the last Ottoman government's reprisal and vengeance against the empire's Armenian population, which they accused of essentially stabbing them in the back as the empire was fighting the Allies and taking advantage of their weakness.
During World War One. Yeah.
And so, the last Ottoman government took very, very strict measures against them, counting for some, on the conservative end, 1 million Armenians being killed, but, all the way upwards to about 2 million Armenians.
And some of what was Armenian territory is now in Turkey.
Correct.
I mean, most notably, there's Mount Ararat.
Correct.
Which is like the symbol of Armenia, but it's not in Armenia any longer.
No, it's not. No,
and people believe some people believe Noah's Ark landed on Mount Ararat right after the flood. I can't prove that, but
and you can. It has a magnificent view from wherever you get to see it. But even to this day, you still don't have formal diplomatic relations between the Republic of Armenia and modern Turkey. So the border's closed.
Really?
Yeah, the border's closed. They've been trying politically to reopen it, and there's been good initiatives. Armenia would certainly like it, as would Turkey. But as with all things like that contentious, everyone's trying to see if there's an opportune time to essentially do it. But there is actually quite strong will on both sides to open that up because it's good border trade, but it's also de-escalation, obviously, of historical sort of animosities. But, there's a lot of baggage there.
Okay. Now, when I first went to Turkey, when in the early days of FDD, again, as I mentioned before, I loved going there. Istanbul is a great city. I remember meeting people from Erdogan's party, and I remember having a fairly benign view of Erdogan at that point back, in the early 2000s, that he was okay, that he was more religious, but there was this is a silly thing to remember, but I remember being in Istanbul and seeing one woman in a hijab standing next to another woman in a halter top.
Right.
Okay. And I thought,
it's very common. Yeah.
Very well. And I thought, what? This is interesting. New York, you wouldn't be surprised to see such a thing. But can this persist in a predominantly Muslim country? Can there be this kind of tolerance that this gets, anyhow? Tell us a little about Erdogan's journey and how he changed, or how our perceptions of him changed over the years, from over the last 20 years or so that he has mostly been in power.
Yeah, I mean, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, shortly before he came to power, once his AK party, the Justice and Development Party, really took the reins of power, which it hasn't let go since through successive elections. The predominant view was that this was sort of a Muslim democracy, the advocates of Muslim democracy, that Erdogan could make this sort of, fusion between, democratic norms and procedures, as well as sort of, Turkey's sort of cultural heritage and ties to Islam, which it was accused, like, the Kemalist secular elites had dampened down and sort of kept under wraps and stymied and stifled, right? So the sort of image that you draw sort of attention to, like, headscarf girl wearing a hijab versus somebody that's wearing a short skirt, like the state tried to sort of, say the ideal citizen was essentially, the uncovered non-hijab wearing secular person, when attempts to just, otherize the hijab wearing woman, maybe the best solution was just to live and let live. Yeah. And that is how, even in Erdogan's Turkey today, you see the confluence of these people. But Erdogan was supposed to sort of came in on this promise of, like, we can make Turkey democratic, but we can be respectful of its culture, its religious views, and, devout people can also have a place in the country, right? We can be a part of the European Union. We can get rid of these sort of diktats of a very sort of oppressive secular state that the authorities under sort of Kemalist ideology sort of imposed upon people. But that was his narrative. And in the early years, we saw signs of that, right?
You thought that too, yeah.
Right? So Erdogan, he engaged with essentially the European Union process.
Right.
He, hobnobbed and shook hands with a lot of European leaders. He was seen as this inspirational figure. Even when Obama came to power, he said basically he coined the term that Turkey was a sort of the model sort of the Muslim country, right?
Yes.
And
people like Obama and others maybe even thought, oh, this is the interlocutor. This is the bridge between Europe and the Middle East, and between Muslim and right.
It was his first foreign trip after he got elected president. If you don't count Canada, Ankara was his first stop, Istanbul and Ankara, and he made a big
for Obama.
Well, for Obama, yeah. So he really wanted to underscore that, because it was, we're positioning to pull out of Iraq. Really sort of, get out of these forever wars.
Yeah.
And so he decided to sort of make Turkey the focus of his attention because it's a NATO member, it's an aspiring member of European Union. He's really, Erdogan made headways with democratic governance. And so that made sense at the time. But, sometime in the last, 10 or slightly more than that years since basically about 2012, 2013, what we've seen with Erdogan is he's completely flipped on a dime, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, at this point, we perceive that he is a Muslim Brotherhood supporter.
Right. Yes, he is.
And he's clearly, demonstrably, a Hamas supporter, Hamas being a militant and wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is at war right now.
Yes.
That's, I don't know, did you think that he evolved in that direction, or that was always, he was just keeping it quiet and biding his time?
Right. So a lot of people have said, what changed? Why did Erdogan change? And I've always thought that was a misnomer because I grew up with Erdogan. That's how I got interested in politics and, the politics of Turkey, because I remember Erdogan sort of bellowing from the rooftops in political speeches when he was mayor of Istanbul, a young and inspiring sort of fiery orator. And even then he was talking sort of deaf to the infidels, down with the Israeli state, the Zionist state and all this sort of stuff. And he refused to shake hands with women at those times. So I've always thought, like, when he aspired to present himself to voters as a pro-European secular sort of thing, that was disingenuous. And, so he's, in my opinion, based on his, the writings that we have done here, our continued research on Erdogan, nothing's changed in him. He's just allowed that to really come and blossom out. I mean, despite his overtures and openings up to Europe, the United States and the West initially, once he felt he could no longer get mileage out of that, he's reverted to his roots, following the Arab uprisings. Even before those, he was very quick to tear apart Turkey's strategic alliance with Israel, which had sort of predated Erdogan.
Right.
And there was no reason to do so. This was pre sort of anything to do with October 7 or anything like that. People were shocked in 2008 when he basically sort of went to Davos, the World Economic Forum. And he publicly berated Israeli
Shimon Peres.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Called him a baby killer. And he came out of nowhere. It was totally unscripted, the foreign ministry tells us.
Yeah.
And then proceeded very quickly to go down this line of, disestablishing Turkey's structured relationship and deep ties with Israel. But it also coincided with the establishment of Hamas in Turkey in 2011, systematically, at the behest of Erdogan, his foreign minister later on, Ahmet Davutoğlu, and now Turkey's current foreign minister, Hakan Fidan. All of these people have very strong ties and affinities to these Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and Islamist, Salafist, jihadist networks, because they see these institutions, these organizations, as very close to how their worldview, and it's their sort of big grievance narrative against the West, which they're fully unleashed in the last 10 years or more.
And what is their grievance with the West? After all, they were a great empire. It's not like they can say, well, we were colonized for 100 years and you exploited our natural resources. What's the grievance?
Well, you'd have to ask them that. But I think it goes there somewhere down the lines of, like, the West exploited the Muslim world. They divvied it up, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the infidel. They'll go down that track. They'll also say, independent of their worldview, they will say, I think this is something Erdogan deeply believes in, that the West is in terminal decline.
What?
And that Turkey has a bigger, larger role to play in the Middle East, and it should exercise those rights because it was cheated out of those at the end of World War I.
By the way, this is an important point, I think, that Kemal Ataturk looked to Europe and they just won the World War I and the Industrial Revolution, and said, this is the future, this is progress.
Right.
We have to be Western if we want to get anywhere. And today, a lot of people in the Muslim world, I think probably in Beijing and Moscow too, say, no, the West is in decline. We don't, and particularly, we don't want to be like them. We don't want to be European. We want to benefit from the decadence and decline we see in the West. And there are, as you know, there are people, not least on the right in this country, who like Putin because they think he's an opponent of Western decadence and seeing decline. Now, I think that's crazy, but that's there. So two things. One is, in a sense, Erdogan is he wouldn't admit this, he is not a Kemalist. The Kemalist revolution, if you'd call it that, he's a counter-revolutionary, even though you have a great statue here on Massachusetts Avenue in front of the embassy of Kemal Ataturk. He's got like a trench coat blowing in the wind. You remember? And it's one of those early 20th century, heroic and pictures of him. He was a very good dresser, Kemal Ataturk.
He really was, yes.
Years ago in Istanbul, I admired a picture of him looking very, very. And somebody said, "Well, we're going to give you a portrait of him then if you admire that."
And that's one in my office.
Yeah, it's in my office.
It's a great picture. You have a poster of him that's kind of like hanging up in the old state offices. It's the quintessential, one of the nicest portraits you can get of him.
Right, well, I'm glad that people do remark on that. Now, in terms of Israel, also, Israelis used to go to Turkey all the time. It was close by. Again, the food was good. They liked it. They loved it. There was a lot of trade relationships. So I think the trade relationship is maintained to some extent despite everything somehow. But now you have, and just the other day, you have Erdogan renewing calls publicly for the destruction, the annihilation of Israel, calling it a Zionist gang or something. I mean, as annihilationist and genocidal as the rhetoric can get. I mean, it's one thing to say to Shimon Peres, "You've done bad things when you fought against Hamas," or so. It's another thing to call for the destruction of the state, which is genocidal.
And it also ignores the fact that Turkey is still home to a sizable population of, Jews.
How many are left there? Do you have any idea?
Last count was probably just under 50,000. A lot of them in the last 10 years, a lot of the Jews in Turkey have decided to sort of seek residence in alternate places, especially Spain, Portugal, some fewer to Israel and even fewer to the United States. But, linking this with your sort of foray into Mustafa Kemal, look, as a counterculture, like... Erdogan really is the antithesis of Turkey's, modern republican project, which is just over 100 years old now. And despite everything he does to try and eradicate, the vision and memory of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, if you see the protests against Erdogan that have erupted in the last few weeks, people are out on the street saying, we want a state that is, that models the vision of Mustafa Kemal, not the sort of authoritarian wasteland that you seek to essentially impose upon us. Despite everything he's done, despite the fact that Erdogan sits on top of the state unchallenged, usurped power, decimated institutions, rule of law, the courts, whatever, he cannot get rid of the memory of Kemal's vision. And that can, with Israel, Turkey is the first Muslim country to recognize the state of Israel, right? Turkey established not just perfunctory relations with Israel subsequent to those years in 1949. Turkey established very significant and close ties to Israel. When you say tourism, that's one thing. That's about 2 million Israelis visiting Turkey every year. The military to military, the economic relationship, the government relationship, the intelligence relationship. I mean, this was so deep and entrenched that even today, despite everything that Erdogan's done to tear that up, if you take a step back and say, what is essentially Turkey's threat perception towards the region it exists in? And if you try to say, how does that differ from Israel's? You'll find them still pretty close overlapping in their interests, which sort of boggles my mind. Turkey considers, along with Israel, Iran as a major threat. Both states consider sort of Salafist jihadist networks a significant problem. We both are allies of the United States and have a vision for non-jihadist sort of governments in the region. These were things that tied the two countries together, supported and buttressed by a strong economic relationship, an intelligence relationship. Erdogan's the only person to tear that up.
Right. But I mean, a Muslim Brotherhood vision of governance and a jihadi vision of governance, there's not a lot of distance between those two, is there?
No, not at this point. I mean, that's certainly the direction that Erdogan's, directed the state. If you ask how many people in Turkey support Erdogan's vision, most people are embarrassed about that.
Well, one thing I want to get in here is, we talked about his evolution. The other thing is that I see him, I'm not the first to say this or alone, that he now perceives himself as a neo-Ottoman.
Right.
That the grievance he has, and this is a grievance among many former empires, not Portugal, not Holland, not Sweden, but certainly China, Russia, Iran, perhaps. That the grievance is, we were a great empire and now we're not, and we want to be again. So he sees himself as, and also as a sultan in this. I mean, he's got a palace that any sultan of the past would envy. It's like $100 million palace? Is
He
I wrong?
decimated an entire forest in Ankara to put up this 1,000-room palace, which is just this gaudy, like, eyesore in the middle of the city that everybody, unfortunately, has to see.
Wow.
But that vision of himself as a new Ottoman Sultan is 100% antithetical and counter to what Mustafa Kemal or Ataturk envisioned, which was renouncement and letting go of all former claims to Ottoman territory. That's what made the Republic of Turkey viable as distinct from the Ottoman Empire. Because remember, Ataturk gave up claims to all former Greek islands, Middle East territory, the Arabian sort of peninsula, so to speak. All claims except the sort of Asia Minor, what Turks call Anatolia, which he said was basically justifiably sort of, the homeland of Turks, because they'd occupied that since the year, the 11th century, so to speak. And that's all they wanted, which was seen to be reasonable. He was a negotiator. He was never a territorial expansionist. Turkey, until Erdogan, never had claims to, like, new territories, as Erdogan has, alluded to, like...
Well, we're going to get to that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. But just a little bit more about these anti-Erdogan protests. Are they based mostly on the idea that we are still Kemalists? We still want a secular state, essentially, and that's what they're objecting to, or is it more complicated?
It's absolutely. I mean, the contextual factors of the present day are more complicated, but at its core, I would say it's precisely what Kemal Atatürk envisioned and entrenched in Turkey for decades. But right now, what he's doing is saying, at this moment in time, Erdogan is so desperate he wants to hold on to power, that sensing that at the first, opportune time in the next elections for president, he sensed that a major opposition figure, who currently happens to be the mayor of Istanbul, was going to challenge him. Ekrem İmamoğlu, this sort of charismatic, firebrand young person, just really captured the hearts and minds of modern, young Turks and voters across the country. Basically was declared to be the presidential candidate for the main opposition party. Just before that primary was concluded, Erdogan decided, instead of wait for him to essentially become the candidate to face off against him, he decided to take matters into his own hands and prevent that happening, and had İmamoğlu arrested. And he hasn't been. He's been charged with corruption, and as a result, he's now in prison in terms of pre-trial detention. He's not been convicted. No charges have been sort of confirmed in court. He's going to spend a lot of years in prison, we think, until basically Erdogan feels secure enough, or maybe indefinitely. But he's basically grabbed power to essentially prevent him being defeated at the polls, which I think was a tipping point for a lot of citizens.
Well, if you take your major competitor and put him in jail on bogus charges, that's sort of the end of a democratic government.
The most basic,
you're now a dictator for real, right? I mean, it's like Putin. Elections in Russia have not for years. There was a time when elections in Russia were probably reasonably free and fair, but it didn't last very long.
And for Turks, just being able to determine who their candidates are, who they elect to run the country, even if it's an imperfect democracy historically, which has had problems with, substantive democratic norms. But in terms of elections and choosing who governs them, that is even incomparable to the Russian example or East European example. Turks are very jealous of that right. And to feel that now for the first time in Turkey's 100+ year history, that's been countermanded. Even the military, once it handed back power to civilian governors, did not get involved into who was going to become a candidate and who the Turks elected to become prime minister.
Right.
They might have grumbled and sometimes sort of intimated or even expressed their concerns about a particular government or prime minister, but never what Erdogan has done, which is summarily lock up a guy prior to him being even running for office on absolute bogus charges.
And the political party that İmamoğlu...
Ataturk's party.
Huh?
It is Ataturk's party.
It is Ataturk's party.
It is the Republican People's Party, Turkey's oldest political party.
But it's not the AK, it's not the Progress...
No. İmamoğlu's party is the it is the party of Ataturk. It's the founding
party of Ataturk, I'm sorry.
Yeah. The founding party of Turkey. And Erdogan's finally met his political match, and he decided to take matters into his own hands and say, I don't care about what this looks like internationally. I don't care if this costs the Turkish economy. I don't care if people, get upset about it. It is regime preservation for Erdogan. He's up against the ropes. He's been in power since 2003. And if there was an election held tomorrow with no impediments, you could probably hold up a stick of cucumber and it would defeat Erdogan.
Oh, he's that unpopular.
He's that unpopular. If you don't get in the way of things, if he didn't let his sort of, cabal sort of interfere in elections or like jail opponents at this point, anybody, I would say at this point, could defeat Erdogan. He's that bad. You got inflation running over 75%. People's, the middle class in Turkey has essentially disappeared.
Really? That bad?
It's terrible. Yeah. So Turkey is running the second or third highest level of inflation in the world.
Why is the economy that bad? Is it because of policy decisions everyone's made?
Because of policy decisions, corruption, just malfeasance, and just bad governance by the Erdogan government over successive years. Just the sort of the Justice and Development Party, its business cronies around it, has become this sort of gluttonous sort of vacuum cleaner that has basically taken all the spoils for itself. And really just become this very sort of corrupt entity that people, have really had a difficult time in holding to account.
And in the past, Turkey had a reasonably dynamic economy.
Yes.
I mean, within the Muslim world, for a nation that doesn't have vast amounts of hydrocarbons in the ground. Yeah. I mean, think of another one that became middle class.
Right.
I'm not sure you can.
Turkey's a G20 country. Even now, it's still ranked. At its height, it reached like the 16th most prosperous economy in the world. And Erdogan did a great job in actually getting Turkey to even today, despite what Erdogan's done to it, Turkey's economy is probably larger than 6 EU countries put together. Because of its sort of manufacturing capacity. But the state is heavily indebted. We have seen sort of major clearinghouses move out of the Istanbul Stock Exchange after the imprisonment. We have huge government, contracts and sort of infrastructure projects which have to be paid off. But essentially, we have, with high rates of inflation, you've had a decimated middle class, and people are now very angry.
That's right. They're what's the population of Turkey?
It's about 80 to 85 million, depending on whether you count the refugees there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty large. Okay, so now the next big thing to talk about is you had the rather sudden fall of the Bashar Assad dynastic dictatorship in Syria. All of a sudden,
right,
taken by a political group or militia group, HTS, Harar Tahrir al-Sham.
Correct, yep.
Right?
Tahrir al-Sham, yep.
Led by Ahmad Shara, who was also known as
Mohammed
al-Jolani, right?
Islam the
Ger. And Erdogan is the key supporter of Ahmad Shah. So that raises a number of questions. Most importantly is, what does Erdogan see Syria as being once again a possession of the Neo-Ottoman Empire?
I think that's the nail on the head. I mean, we talked about Turkey's aspirations for Neo-Ottomanism or Erdogan's, and this is it, right? Yeah. He sensed sort of an opportunity, seeing after Hezbollah and Hamas's sort of destruction at the hand of Israel, a weakened Iran in the region, and its patronage of the
that was
Syrian
really
state.
Key, because Hezbollah was keeping Bashar al-Assad afloat to a great extent. And Iran was, because it was essentially a colony of Iran.
Right. Exactly. And the Russians also got far distracted with the war in Ukraine. So
because they had established and enlarged naval bases that gave them a warm water port, all of that.
Exactly.
Right.
And Erdogan has since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, this is the first time he has so desired to topple the Assad regime and desirous of regime change in Damascus, because Erdogan has wanted a sort of region ruled by Sunni leaders, Arab leaders that are sort of close to his vision, of his Muslim Brotherhood vision, expansionist vision of the region. And so as soon as he sensed the weakness, I think at the end of 2024, I think Erdogan greenlit, and they're very proud of kind of explicitly sort of admitting to this, saying, yep, we pushed the button for HTS, with Shiraz saying, now's the time to take it. And then we saw the fall of Assad in less than 24 hours, and Turkish flags hung over the walls of Aleppo by, HTS militias. But it's not just the HTS he backs. There's also another massive disparate group of militias under the banner of the Syrian National Army, which is about these 20 or 22 sort of jihadist militia groups directly paid for, logistically supported, armed and trained by the Turkish military. that are also sort of camped out across, in parts of northwestern Syria, and they play a heavy hand in ensuring Shiraz regime now takes root. And
so they're loyal to Shiraz, pretty much.
No, they're loyal to Erdogan.
They're loyal to Erdogan.
Yeah.
So for Erdogan, it's what Erdogan says.
And so Shiraz is supposed to meet with Erdogan sometime this week. Because he's worried that if he doesn't have Erdogan on side, Shiraz worried that he is not going to be able to essentially control this sort of militia elements that help him keep law and order in the country, because they get paid by the Turks.
So he's dependent on Erdogan, and he will have to be his, I would imagine, his regent, his satrap, to use the Persian word, in his governor general, which may not please him, but he may not have any choice. And these Syrian militias that Erdogan supports. And this is a concern, it should be a concern for the U.S. I know it's a concern for Israelis. There's a Kurdish population, particularly in the northeast of Syria.
Yep.
They would like autonomy. They're not asking for more. But they mostly don't want is to be wiped out.
Correct.
By Turkey and by Turkish-backed militias.
Correct.
And Erdogan has long been viciously, I would say, anti-Kurdish. He doesn't even like the idea that the Kurds consider themselves a distinct nationality.
Correct.
Which they are. Their languages are more Persianate than they are Turkish. The Azerbaijanis speak a Turkic language, but the Kurds do not. Then they're from a different background and cultures. But he calls them Mountain Turks and that sort of thing. And he just will not. Not. But I think it's a serious. I mean, the Kurds of Syria have been hit hard on a number of occasions now. I mean, probably dozens by these militias and maybe by Turkey.
Yeah, and it's hard to extrapolate the U.S. national interest here, but I think it's a direct one, and I think it's worth listeners sort of bearing this in mind. It's not just that we liked Kurds in that part of the world. It's not that they helped us. Basically, we offloaded our desire to sort of defeat the Islamic State, which the Kurds, embedded with U.S. special forces, even to this date, helped contain, but also militarily degraded the Islamic State back in the middle of the 2010s. But more importantly, today, if we don't have a reasonable assurance from the Turks by direct support for the Syrian Kurds, right, and we see them sort of be militarily targeted and even like engaged by the Turkish army, what could happen is a disillusionment and dismemberment of the entire sort of Syrian landmass, and what we have there is a potential power vacuum, just an imploded state, which is regional chaos. That would imperil and threaten Israel's security. It would imperil Arab states that are, our allies, like the Saudis, the Emiratis, if not the Egyptians. They would be concerned with an ungoverned space.
There's two things I want to bring up here. One is we have American elite troops, a very small number, maybe 1,000. I've heard some different figures.
It's about 2,000.
Maybe 2,000 now.
Special operators.
I fear a little bit that Trump will want to bring them back. He thought about that very seriously in his last administration. Almost did it. James Mattis resigned as defense secretary because of that. The work they're doing is important. It's been to suppress the Islamic State, to deprive them of their territory. They still exist. To suppress them. And what they've done is the elite troops have worked with mostly Kurdish, some Arab, mostly Kurdish forces, and been able to with American backing, they've been able to be very successful. By the way, not least in keeping incarcerated in essentially camps various Islamic State terrorists. If the U.S. were to leave and the Kurds were to be badly hit, all those terrorists would spread out across the Middle East into Europe and probably into the United States.
Correct.
I think the work they're doing is important. Also, there's oil resources there that the U.S. is keeping out of what used to be out of Iranian hands. I guess it could be at Turkish hands at this point.
Yeah. And that's yes. And what we should say is Erdogan has requested a one-to-one meeting with Trump before the end of this month in April.
Yeah.
And his foreign minister has been basically, schmoozing with Secretary of State Rubio a couple of times this month, actually, since the middle of March up until now. And the Turks are trying to lay the groundwork to essentially say, hey, to the Trump administration, hey, look, leave Syria to us.
Yeah.
We can take care of that for you because we're your friends. We're allies, right? Don't worry about the Kurds. Don't worry about anything. We'll take care of that for you. And in return, you can give us things that we would like to acquire. We have policy goals and things that we're interested in having with the United States. So don't worry about Syria. We can have that for you wrapped up in a lovely bow. And the worry is, obviously, Trump might essentially say, oh, okay, and which a repeat of what we saw back in his first term, which resulted in massive resignation. But the Israeli prime minister is obviously in town today, and there's been some reporting in the past 2 days suggesting that Netanyahu will ask Trump essentially to say, hey, look, the Turks are concerned for us. Don't listen to Erdogan's sort of peddling of snake oil. He's not going to take care of Syria. He's going to enable sort of these jihadist elements inside of Syria.
Kill a lot of Kurds.
Kill a lot of Kurds, but directly threaten us too.
Well, that's the other thing is that what the Israelis have done in Syria since the revolution against Assad has been to first destroy as much of the military infrastructure that Assad had in place as possible, so that Ahmed Shara the new regime can't utilize that.
Right.
And then the Israelis have stationed themselves, their troops on Mount Hermon and a few other places where they are doing a number of things. One is, I think, sending a message to Erdogan: if you're going to make this into a colony, and then you also are going to militarize it and have military infrastructure on our borders threatening us, that would be a bad idea.
Right.
Because we are not going to permit that, especially after what we've been through. And that does raise the possibility that if Erdogan wants to just say, well, yeah, I've got the strongest military in NATO other than the United States. So if you want to fight me, but I'm going to do what I want to do in what is now my colony. I mean, you have the prospect of a war between a NATO member and America's closest ally in the Middle East. That's a pretty frightening scenario.
Right, and some people think that sort of level of escalation is far-fetched. I don't. I think it's more like because, as you said, as the Israelis have bombed a lot of former Syrian military infrastructure. One of those was just a few days ago. This airbase, T4
airbase, right?
Which the Turks had in their sights to essentially lay down a significant their Turkish Air Force capability, which would have basically meant, Turkish F-16 stationed inside of Syria, right across from the Israeli forces. But also being able to, launch those F-16s into the plane and presumably, escalate and sort of, raise tensions against the Israeli sort of jets flying in the air too. But use these air military bases as a means to project power from Syria to the wider region. And the Israelis just took out that airbase once again, just to make sure it send a very clear message to Ankara saying, hey, we're not really happy with this, back off. And that's a very clear signal. And the Turks have yet to respond.
And there's one other thing that the Israelis have done. Syria, look, I think it's fair to say Syria is not naturally a nation. Again, as we were talking about earlier, you had, and even historically, who were the major nations of the Middle East? There were Turks, Egyptians, Persians, Iranians, Jews. Then you had Sykes-Picot, which was after the end of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. You get a Brit and a French, and they say, let's create some nations on the map. We'll just draw some lines here. Again, what are you going to do? But Iraq, Syria, even Lebanon, these are not in any historical way nation states. But Syria, because you have a very diverse population there, Christians and in particular, you have in the southern part of Syria, you have the Druze. Mm-hmm. Now, why do the Israelis have an interest in the Druze particularly? Because there's a significant Druze population in Israel. They're very loyal. They're in the military. They're unlike, even though they're Arabs, they're not Arab Muslims. They not only join the military, they expect to be drafted into the military. Mm. Arabs can volunteer, Christian Arabs, Muslim Arabs can volunteer for the Israeli military, but the Druze said early on after the creation of Israel, the Israelis said, you don't have to be, like other Arabs, you don't have to be in the military. Said, no, yes, we do. Yes, we do. You'll draft us, but like everybody else, because we're going to be good. So they have relatives in southern Syria. Mm. So the Israelis have now said, it would be, I don't know quite how they phrased it, but essentially said it'd be a very bad idea for anybody just to go after the Druze in southern Syria, and we're not going to allow that to happen. No militias whatsoever can go and threaten the Druze of southern Syria, which I'm sure was something that the Druze of Israel wanted to hear, and they were going to do. But that also creates some tensions if you who knows?
But one thing that Turkey forgets here in escalating tensions along its sort of, I would say now closer border with Israel, right? If it's directly occupying Syria as a colony, then it's directly basically neighbors with Israel. But what it's underestimating, I think Erdogan taken this into account, would be to say that the Israelis have far more friends in the region than Turkey does. We have countries that signed the Abraham Accords.
Right.
We have an Israeli state which has very sort of close ties, I think the closest ties with the United States. And if you look at Turkey, on the other hand, Turkey has a very troubled relationship with the United States. And if it chooses to escalate militarily in any shape or form with the United States, with Israel, I think it's going to have problems with Washington, to say the least. But also, if you look at across the Muslim world, Turkey does not really have many friends there. I mean, it has done a bang up job in really royally peeing off, so to speak, the Saudis, the Emiratis, right, the Egyptians. You name it. There's only one country I can think of in the entire Middle East that Turkey has cordial and substantive ties with, and that's Qatar, right? Everyone else does not wish Erdogan to have a dominant position inside the region, least of all threatening military conflict with the Israelis, which nobody wants. So our Ankara is very, very isolated there. And yes, it may have the second largest military in NATO, but first of all, that's relatively untested military. And secondly, it's a costly thing to engage in a regional conflict with a behemoth that is Israel, which has infinitely more friends and sort of motivation to sort of stick to securing its borders, whereas Ankara would be basically engaging in belligerent behavior inside of a state which it doesn't belong to inside, and sort of threatening the borders of an existing state with Israel for no other reason because Erdogan wishes death and destruction to the state of Israel. So I don't know who he seeks to elicit the support of, but I don't think he has many sort of friends to join this sort of merry little gang.
Two more controversies that come to mind, and then I'll either let you go or let you mention anything else you want to mention. One is that the Turks want the American F-35 aircraft, very, very advanced aircraft. The Israelis have quite a few. The U.S. has up to now been saying, we're not going to give you those because you, as a NATO member, did something you really shouldn't do. You went to the Russians and said, give me air defenses, the S-300 and maybe the S-400.
S-400 missiles, yeah.
Yeah. And to have those and the F-35s will make American F-35 aircraft more vulnerable to being shot down,
right?
Because you'll be able to, do whatever you need, whatever the engineers can do. And that controversy is, it's still going on. My impression is you got to say to the Turks, you got to get rid of all those missile defenses you bought from Russia. By the way, the Israelis showed last year that they know how to beat them. They were not effective against the Israelis. Flying F-35s, I believe. Yeah.
Right, exactly. I mean, our FDD colleague, John Shans and I, we just put out a piece in The Hill recently imploring the administration, hey, look,
of course,
the F-35 is a strategic platform that we should only share with our closest allies, right? And Turkey was a part of that. It wasn't that we kept Turkey at a distance. It was part of the production consortium. It was due to receive over 100 units of this. But it really, made it some bad choices against the imploring of the United States as well as other NATO countries to purchase these S-400 missiles. And it has also continued to threaten allies, other sort of NATO allies in the region, not least of all Greece, but also European Union country members in the Eastern Mediterranean, notably Cyprus, right, militarily. But it's also threatening Israel. As we also alluded to, Turkey is the only member of NATO that advocates for a universally almost recognized terrorist entity that is Hamas, which, we've all seen NATO members have different sort of opinions about Israeli actions in Gaza against Hamas, but no one inside of NATO has openly embraced this terrorist organization. That's a problem. And now we're hearing rumors suggesting that Turkey is facilitating and aiding Hezbollah, or what's left of it, by allowing Syria to be used as a transit route for them to be resupplied. You start adding these things up, right? And you say, why on earth should Washington give Turkey F-35s, which would basically just encourage further bad behavior? And it's because of this, that's what, the groundwork that, the Turkish foreign minister and Erdogan's been laying with Trump, saying, look, you will take care of Syria for you, but if you could just give us F-35s, and what we'll do is we'll basically, what we can do for you is we may destroy 1 or 2 units of the S-400 that we have in our possession, just as a gesture of goodwill. And I was like, that's not good enough.
That's not good enough. By the way, you say the economy of Turkey is not good. F-35s are rather expensive aircraft.
Yeah, but they have a down payment for that. They've already paid for those.
Oh, so okay.
So they want their money's worth. But we should say, despite everything that Turkey's done, Last year, Congress approved the sale of the brand new F-16s to Turkey, saying, okay, we understand you need to modernize your air force because your existing F-16s are old and they're aging, etc., etc. They're at the end of their life. But okay, well, in return for you approving the membership, joining of Sweden and Finland to NATO, which you held up for 18 months because of, you were doing Putin's bidding. Despite that, after, we agreed to sell you F-16s because we want NATO's member states to have capable air forces. The only time we should still begin entertaining the idea of Turkey being brought back into the F-35 is not when it destroys 1 or 2 units of its S-400s. No. It's when it donates all of its S-400s to Ukraine, when it stops fraternizing and basically hobnobbing with Putin, when it disestablishes and expels Hamas from its territories and says, I am Team NATO. I'm going to stand with our European and American allies against terrorist organizations, against Russian aggression in the region. It should not be a heavy lift. Once Turkey's put forward a demonstrable record in sort of meeting its obligations like other NATO and European powers, then we can begin discussing some years in the future if it's a good idea to bring them back into the fold. We're only now just starting to talk about Germany, seeing if, is it time that Germany should rearm itself? And that's almost,
right.
80, 90 years after the end of World War II. And the Germans are their own best self-critics. So
I meant to mention earlier, didn't, that you also just released recently a comprehensive memo on Turkey's ties with Hamas, along with John Chandler, but also Melissa Sachs and our friend Michael Rubin from AEI.
That's right, yeah. The most, sort of, I would say, sort of detailed compendium of Turkey's deep ties to Hamas in that exists out there anyway. I think was a long time coming for us.
Right. Okay, well, I had one more thing on my notes to mention, and that's the controversy over the ambassador to...
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
what we can say about that is, the previous administration appointed Jeff Flake, the former senator from Arizona. And, the problem with Senator Flake as ambassador to Turkey was that, first of all, he was the first political appointee to a realm which is usually seen as a definite career appointee.
Right, because it's not like going to Brussels or Norway exactly. or Netherlands. There's a lot you need to know.
Right, it was always a high-profile appointment. So we've had heavyweights in there like John Bass before, or David Satterfield,
Eric Edelman.
These are sort of established foreign service professionals. Jeff Flake, there was nothing wrong in his name except that he was seen to be sort of an appeaser of Ankara, who basically just before the end of his term was the one who resuscitated this idea of Turkey being brought back into the F-35s. And he stepped down shortly before the end of Biden's term, saying he had no interest in sort of being a holdover. But now the new administration has nominated Tom Barrack, which is a sort of American businessman with Lebanese sort of heritage, I think. And his congressional testimony sort of seems to suggest that he hasn't been too critical of Ankara either, in terms of he hasn't been declarative on the F-35 issue or whether he would be tough on Turkey in terms of its ties with Hamas or not. We also know that Secretary of State Rubio has been very critical of Turkey in the past, both in his writings and the legislation he sponsored. But so far, we have not seen sort of anything to sort of suggest that Turkey would be held under a sort of wider magnifying lens and a steeper spotlight to say, hey, look, enough's enough. There's a whole lot of grievances we have, not just the United States, but all of NATO has. It's time to make a choice. And this administration is well poised to do that. The question is, will the new ambassador, as well as the Secretary of State, really hold Ankara to account? Given that in the next month or so, we're going to have probably high-level meetings between Trump and Erdogan. So the opportunity is there, but they need to make good on it.
Well, maybe we should get together again after the meeting between Erdogan and Trump and talk about what you see has come out of that. We might want to do that.
Yeah, that could be a good opportune time, yeah.
Thank you so much for coming in today. Great to have this conversation with you. Learned a lot. I think everybody listening learned a lot, too. Thank you, Sinan.
Great to be here. Thanks for doing this. Thank you.
Thanks for all of you who have stayed with us for this conversation here today on Foreign Policy.